and we're delighted to have Dr. James Finch here to introduce that exhibition to us. He's a specialist in British art of the 19th and 20th centuries, and currently he's a curator, assistant curator of 19th century art at Tate Britain. He worked most recently at the Tate on the wonderful Turner's Modern World, which again many of you will have seen, I hope, and last summer at the Rossettis. Before joining the Tate, he was a curatorial assistant at the Royal Academy of Arts, and he has published widely on 19th and 20th century arts. James, we're delighted that you could come this morning.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Special thanks to Angela Cox and Richard Ormond for extending this invitation to speak to you today. And I'm very happy to be here speaking about Sargent and Fashion. Sargent and Fashion. So this is an exhibition which was several years in the planning, as I'll speak a bit more about later. It was organised from the outset as a collaboration with the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and it's very significant as a co-organised exhibition that the exhibition is being held in Boston and London, two cities which were highly significant to Sargent throughout his career, and fittingly the Tate and the MFA being two of the institutions with leading Sargent collections anywhere in the world. And as Angela said in her very kind introduction, this is an exhibition which we hope does indicate a new direction in Sargent studies, because there have been so many exhibitions about Sargent, but I do believe that this is an exhibition which does find a new perspective on his work by incorporating the fashion element in, and by including the original garments, and in some cases similar garments to those painted by Sargent in his portraits, which really enable you to get a new sense of Sargent's working practice and how he takes clothing as his raw material and how he intervenes in the process of painting it and turning it into a painting. So this is going to be something of a hybrid lecture in which I'd like to accomplish two things. The first of which is to talk you through the show and its concepts and the ideas involved in it. And the second part of which is to take you behind the scenes in some way and to talk a little about the planning, how the exhibition came to be, and some of the logistics and some of the elements which often kind of go unnoticed, but which I would like to take this opportunity to draw some attention to. So the slide that you're looking at the moment as an introduction to the show puts centre stage one of the standout works in the exhibition, Lady Agnew of Loch Nor, which is on loan from the National Galleries of Scotland. And this is really one of the highlights of the exhibition, and a work which we were so pleased to be able to include. Just to draw attention to a couple of things, one of which is the way in which the paintings are framed in the exhibition. Those of you who have been to the exhibition at Tate will already have a sense of this, and anyone who hasn't been yet, I hope that you will go soon. Something that I was very conscious of in arranging the installation of the exhibition was thinking about sight lines and the way in which, as you turn a corner and you look from one room into the next, thinking very deliberately about the perspective you will have on what lies ahead. And there are a number of works in the show in which we framed in this way, as Lady Agnew is shown here. So she is on this freestanding partition wall, all on her own, so that she really, as you turn the corner from the previous room, this is the perspective that you have on her. And I think it's a very effective one, which really makes the most of the drama of this painting. And another thing to note about this view is the way in which it shows the wall colours, which again are something which I thought about very carefully as a way of differentiating the sections in the exhibition and to creating something of a rhythm as we go from one section into the next. So I'm not sure how much you all know about Sargent, so this may all be extremely familiar to you, but just to say a few words about Sargent himself and his career and his trajectory. These are three images of Sargent that you can see on the screen before you. So Sargent was born in Florence in 1856 to expatriate American parents who largely for health reasons, travelled around Europe during the years of Sargent's upbringing. So most of his upbringing was spent in either Germany or France or Italy. And when he resolved to become an artist, the family moved to France in the 1870s, to Paris, which was very much the centre of the international art world at that time. Sargent's early successes were experienced in Paris in the 1870s and early 1880s, up until he decided to move to Britain following the exhibition of Madame X at the Paris Salon in 1884, on which more later. And from around 1885 until the end of his life in 1925, Sargent's primary residence was in London, on Tate Street in Chelsea. Although as his career progressed, he spent an increasing amount of his time on the other side of the Atlantic as his client base developed in Boston and New York in particular. And in the last 30 years of Sargent's life, another aspect of his work which took up increasing prominence in his life was these ambitious mural cycles which he executed in Boston in the Public Library and the Museum of Fine Arts. He also made murals for the Widener Library in Harvard as well. So that was actually, although this is not a part of the Sargent and Fashion exhibition, this is a very large part of Sargent's later career, which often goes undiscussed because it is somewhat separate to his career as a portraitist, and the ways in which those different parts of his artistic personality are somewhat in tension with each other is always interesting to think about. In the later part of Sargent's career, he also travels more, he paints more and more landscapes, and he also becomes a war artist. And you'll be familiar with Gast, his masterpiece of 1919, which has recently been restored in the Imperial War Museums and looks much enhanced as a result of that conservation project. See that in the Blavatnik galleries if you haven't already done so. But I just say this to just make the point about what a diverse artist Sargent really was. One thing which is sometimes said about Sargent and Fashion is that it focuses on a specific lens on Sargent, which is wholly intentional. But I think it's always important to point out how much is left out from that, and how much we can't. It's not a retrospective of Sargent. It's focusing on his work as a portraitist in particular. And I wanted to put these three images before you, partly to introduce Sargent and also to make the point about Sargent's personality, and basically the point that, perhaps unusually for a portrait painter, he made relatively few self-portraits. Unlike someone like Rembrandt, and of course you have the wonderful Rembrandt self-portrait here, he was at the other end of the spectrum to Rembrandt. He was not interested in painting himself and would tend to only do so when obliged to. So the painting that you see on the left of this slide is a self-portrait that he made for the Accademia in Florence when he was elected to be a member of that institution. And it was, like the diploma works at the Royal Academy, it was a condition of entry that you would submit a self-portrait. So Sargent made this self-portrait for the Accademia, but this was not something that he normally would have done. He would need a catalyst or an impetus to do so. In the center of this slide, there's a photograph of Sargent at work making a charcoal drawing taken by Sarah Choate Sears, who is in fact one of the sitters whose portrait by Sargent is included in Sargent and Fashion. And we reproduced this photograph in Sargent and Fashion because we wanted to convey that Sarah Choate Sears, as well as sitting for Sargent, also turned the camera on him, so to speak, and was one of many sitters for Sargent who actually had an artistic practice of their own. And I like to think about the relationship between Sargent and his sitters as one in which the people he painted were not just passively sitting for him, but they were people who were artistic personalities in their own right, and who would often be taking something from that experience of sitting for Sargent and be incorporating it into their own artistic life. And Sears was very much one of those. She was a quite significant pictorialist photographer and a member of Stieglitz's Photo Succession and the Linked Ring. And so I do like this photograph of Sargent by Sears because it's also one of few photographs of Sargent at work. And on the right is a caricature of Sargent by Max Beerbohm, which is actually the last work that you see in the exhibition. You might even catch a glimpse of it. Yeah, you can see it on the very far right of this slide. This is the last work in the exhibition, which I actually added at the last moment because I realized that I wanted to have this likeness of Sargent, partly because Max Beerbohm, I think, is a caricaturist who he makes so many caricatures of Sargent and his circle. He's so good at evoking Sargent and his period, but also because it again shows Sargent as he was wont to represent himself and as he dressed himself in this dark woolen suit. Sargent was, unlike many of the people he painted, not an extrovert, not someone who cultivated or sought attention, but someone who really cultivated the dress of the bourgeois, kind of these dark suits. And on the interpretation for this work in the exhibition, we actually include a quotation from Wilfred Scowen Blunt, who bumped into Sargent without knowing who he was, and later told a friend that once he realized who it was, Sargent to him seemed like a good-looking chap who rather reminded him of a superior mechanic, which I think is just one of the best things anyone ever said about Sargent. And, you know, in a way, he was a superior mechanic in the mechanics of painting. But I think that really sums it up. And this is all a roundabout way of getting to the structure of the show and a point I want to make, which is that it is not a chronological journey through Sargent's career, but it's one in which we are thinking more about the themes underlying Sargent's portraiture. So the rooms of the exhibition, which I'll talk you through in a moment, are about themes such as performance or expression or status. Those are the things that we wanted to hone in on. And in doing so, by bringing together works from different periods of Sargent's career. There have been many great exhibitions about particular moments in Sargent's career, whether he's in Paris or London or America, but that's not what we wanted to do here. We wanted to be quite fluid. I think one of the advantages of that is that we can be quite creative in the way that the works are put together. We can make some quite surprising juxtapositions, but it also means that we're freed from narrating Sargent's story as we go through the exhibition. We can actually speak more about the works themselves and what they're doing. But to compensate for that, just for people who were not already familiar with Sargent, we did put this timeline at the entrance to the exhibition. And so there's a couple of images here, one of which shows the start of the timeline. And I spent a lot of time thinking about which photograph of Sargent to represent him as the very first step on the timeline. This was one of many works which was very difficult to source the reproduction image for. So it was a great thrill to me that we were able to get this photograph of Sargent by Pratt and have it on the timeline. But I think that's the kind of thing that means a lot to me that no one else will ever understand. It's just how significant it was to me. And the image on the right-hand side here actually is the timeline in the process of going up, which, again, many of the images on this PowerPoint are actually snapshots that I took during the installation just to document it for myself. For me, it's quite interesting to see just how this vinyl lettering and how the timeline is applied. So the contractors would come in and they would very meticulously line up all of the rows of text and the images, and then they would be transferred onto the wall, this vinyl lettering. But this is all to anchor your sense of Sargent, so that if you're not familiar with Sargent and his work, before you go into the exhibition, you can get the contours of his life that I've just recounted to you. So in terms of the concept and where it started from, I think this really began with the co-curator of the exhibition in Boston, Erica Hirschler, and a paper that she gave back in, I think it was 2017, for a conference in Paris, in which she spoke about the figure of the dandy in Sargent's male portraiture in particular. And I think given that so many of the portraits that are reproduced and so much of the way that Sargent is thought about most commonly is as a painter of women, it's interesting that the starting point was actually figures of men such as these. So on the screen here, you see on the left-hand side W. Graham Robertson, and on the right, Lord Ribblesdale. And these are two really good examples of the way that fashion and creative choices around clothing figure within Sargent's male portraiture. So to take Graham Robertson, for instance, on the left, this is a portrait which was not commissioned by the sitter, but like many of the most interesting works in the exhibition, it actually came from Sargent seeking out the sitter, because Sargent saw Robertson around London in this long, slim Chesterfield overcoat and actually got a message to him to ask to paint him. So it was Sargent's own initiative, and Sargent having seen seen Robertson and envisaged the portrait in him. And this is a painting which was made in the heat of summer in London. And yeah, you can see where this is going. And Robertson would protest about having to wear this thick overcoat and ask if he could take it off, to which Sargent replied, "No, the coat is the picture, you must wear it." And so there's this somewhat farcical scene that you can imagine of Robertson having to take off his clothing underneath the coat and put the coat back on. So by the end of the sittings, he's basically just wearing the coat with nothing underneath it, because yes, the coat is the picture. And Sargent really accentuates the slenderness of the coat. He actually makes Robertson look rather younger than he actually was. Robertson was in his mid-30s at this point, but Sargent really kind of makes him this real kind of apotheosis of the dandy. The canvas is very narrow. He has all of these strong verticals which kind of rhyme with the figure of Robertson. For instance, this jade-tipped cane that he has. And so yes, it's a very distinctive picture in which he's really captivated by this coat. We make the point repeatedly through the exhibition of how much Sargent loves painting blacks and dark greys, and he's really a master of capturing the play of light on dark fabric. And you can see the strong lighting from the left on the Robertson portrait. And on the right, we have another extremely fastidious figure, Lord Ribblesdale, the politician, who is painted by Sargent wearing what was referred to as his rat catcher garb, which was a kind of an unorthodox hunting costume. So Ribblesdale loved hunting, but he actually was consciously archaic in what he wore for hunting. And also he made it a practice to wear this about town. So it was very much part of his brand and his identity. And it was said of Ribblesdale in particular that he was someone who never stepped out of his own picture frame, had this very self-conscious sense of himself as a personality. And he was very engaged with the practice of selecting with Sargent what he would wear for this portrait and everything about the portrait. So this idea of a collaboration, I think, comes through very strongly throughout the exhibition. There are stories of Sargent and Ribblesdale walking around London, looking at the architecture, and Somerset House in particular, looking for inspiration for potential columns or pilasters for the kind of the architecture that could be used in the background of the painting to give a suitably classicizing sense to the work. And one more thing about the Ribblesdale painting is that I think it's easy for us now to miss some of the subtleties about the slightly archaic or historical nature of Ribblesdale's dress. And certainly this is something that I only learned about in researching the portrait. But when you look at the Vanity Fair caricatures of the day and the Punch caricatures, one of which we reproduce on the label next to the work, they talk about Ribblesdale's dress as if it was out of the Regency period. And they talk about him as looking like a time traveler of some sort. So these are the sort of things that you can get out of a portrait like this from investigating the contemporary sources. I'll take you through section by section in a moment, but I want to say three general things that we wanted to think about all the way through the exhibition in terms of that title of Sargent and Fashion. And the first, which I've already said, is Sargent as a lover of textiles, and just emphasizing how much and how often the garments that he painted would be sort of the thing that he was most interested in. And you certainly get this later on in his career when he starts giving paintings titles like Kashmir or Two Girls in White Dresses. And he starts to the garments start to take the names of the paintings rather than the people who are sitting in them. Just looking at the amount of the space that a dress might occupy within a canvas, or the attention that Sargent is paying to a garment in particular. You had that story about Robertson and the coat, and you'll see it again with something like Ellen Terry and her beetle wing dress. Often it is the dress or the garment as much as the sitter, which is behind Sargent's impulse to paint someone. And something else about Sargent and the particular moment that he's working in is that it coincides with the rise of couture. And we talk about this in the exhibition, particularly in relation to the House of Worth and Charles Worth. These kind of early great couturiers are basically almost contemporary with Sargent in terms of their chronology. And we think about Sargent in Paris in particular, which was, of course, the center of couture. And that's something that Sargent would have grown up with. And during this period, we were getting, for instance, the rise of the name designer. When you think about things that we take for granted within the fashion industry today, kind of big names, Worth was certainly the first of those. And the designer of thinking of themselves in terms of being an artist. Worth talks about himself, he would compare himself to Delacroix. He would say that he has an artist's sense of color and composition. And so this, particularly at a time when there are so many museum shows, I would say, dedicated to whether it's Chanel, Dior, Galliano, McQueen, whoever, this sense that we take for granted that the fashion designer can be viewed as a kind of artist. This was something which was establishing itself concurrently with Sargent's career. And this feeds into the very public nature of Sargent's portraiture. So most of the portraits in this exhibition were first exhibited at either the Royal Academy exhibition in London or the Paris Salon. So they were public works. They were paintings of people who wanted to be seen, who wanted their likenesses to be talked about and appraised and written about in this very public arena. And when you read about the critical notices and the reviews of portraits during this period, it often stated who a dress was made by, if it is known, and the dress or the outfit would be spoken about often as much, if not more, than the painting itself. So there's this kind of slippage between the portrait as its own autonomous creation and the way in which it is sort of a lens to view real people and to look at real garments. So there's this quite interesting and complicated way in which painting and fashion are overlapping with each other. So just as an example for that, the portrait that you see here of Mary Hammersley, when Sargent painted this portrait of Hammersley wearing this quite bold cherry cerise coloured gown, there was a lot of discourse in the press and in the art newspapers about not just the painting and how successful the painting was, but very much about the dress itself, because the dress was something that wouldn't have been possible 20 or 30 years previous. It was made of aniline and chemical dyes, which had only recently been patented and developed. And so it's very much a contemporary dress. And what the critics would talk about was, can you paint a dress like this, which is so unfamiliar in the kind of the long context of the history of portraiture? Can you paint a dress like this in a way that still is befitting of grand manner portraiture? Or is it just, too gaudy? Is it just too unbecoming? That's the kind of thing that critics would talk about. And so Sargent is very much having to walk this tightrope, I think, between being in dialogue with contemporary developments in fashion, while at the same time being cognizant of his own position in the history of portraiture and painting portraits which the critics and patrons see as similarly capable of hanging on a wall alongside Van Dyck or a Gainsborough portrait. And so it's a very kind of interesting and knotty relationship, I think, between Sargent and what's going on in that time in the world of fashion. So as I said, the exhibition is not chronological, although it does include works from across the whole range of Sargent's career. So I think the earliest work in the exhibition dates from around 1879, when Sargent is 23 years old. It's one of his first Paris portraits. And the latest work in the exhibition dates from 1923, just a couple of years before his death, when Sargent is very rarely painting portraits anymore. He essentially renounces painting portraits in around 1907, when he becomes increasingly grumpy and writing to friends and family about, ask me to paint anything, ask me to paint your door, just don't ask me to paint a portrait. He says all these kind of things. So he does kind of withdraw from portraiture to concentrate more on the landscapes and the murals, but he continues to paint family and friends right up until the end. So I'll go through section by section for anyone who hasn't seen the exhibition. So we actually start with quite a late portrait. This is Lady Sassoon from 1907. And we start with this juxtaposition of one portrait with one garment. And in this case, it is the portrait of Lady Sassoon with the black taffeta opera cloak that she wears. And the point that we want to make here is how differently the opera cloak falls versus the way that it's painted in the portrait. So if you look here on the portrait, you'll see that there's sort of pink stripe which runs across Lady Sassoon's body. And this is, in fact, the pink lining of the opera cloak, which you can catch a glimpse of on the sleeves there. And of course, we've picked that out for the room color. But what Sargent does is not paint this garment as it falls naturally, which I think would have made for quite a drab portrait, but he's in fact turned the gown out so that you get this really wonderful flash of the pink lining running across, and which really compositionally takes you from the very strong lighting on the head down, following the pink down to the right hand of Lady Sassoon, which flicks very elegantly. And I think this really encapsulates the show in one juxtaposition, because it's what Sargent is doing. It's how he's asserting his creativity and his invention in a way that is akin to a stylist or a fashion director. He would often get his tailoring pins out and hold clothes in place. One of his sitters actually said that kind of their abiding memory was like the pins often pricking when Sargent kind of didn't get it quite right. But, he was very hands-on in that way. So from there, we go to Women in Black, which Lady Sassoon is one example of. Sargent having this love of painting black women in black, and often black on black, so black garments against black backgrounds, and working with this very restricted palette. When the painter Luke Fildes visited Sargent in Paris, he wrote to a friend of Sargent, his colour was black. And when Sargent visited Monet, there's a story which Monet recounts of Sargent asking him for some colours to paint and learning that Monet didn't have any black, and Sargent saying, well, I can't paint if you don't have black, which I think makes quite a nice point about Sargent and Monet, because they were friends. There was a lot of dialogue between them, and you do see the Monet influence on Sargent quite strongly in some cases. Sargent owned several works by Monet, but there's also that difference which that expresses quite well. So we put Madame X quite early in the exhibition. I won't spend too much time on this wonderful masterpiece today. The story is very well known, but this is the work which really precipitated Sargent's move to London, because when it was first exhibited in Paris, the right strap of Madame Gautreau's dress was off the shoulder, and this was the source of much kind of critical consternation. It was really something of a scandal, to the extent that Gautreau's own mother said, my daughter's reputation is ruined. Speaking of fashion and clothing, I mean, that the fact that a strap can have that much impact tells you about how coded these societies were, and just how much that decision could impact upon Gautreau and upon Sargent. So Sargent, following the exhibition, he repainted the strap, although we do reproduce a photograph of the work in its original state. So there is documentary evidence of how the painting first looked. But following this exhibition, Sargent moved to London because he would write to friends at the time that he feared for the lack of future potential patrons, worrying about what might happen if they let Sargent paint their portrait. Two other works from this room, Women in Black. The point here is about Black going during Sargent's career from kind of early 19th century, Black being very associated with mourning and grieving clothing, but really becoming worn in a much wider range of contexts during the 19th century, whether it is chic evening wear, as in the case of Virginie Gautreau's painting, or in the case of Maria Davis and Eleanora Iselin here for these walking dresses as day wear for going out and about. One of my favorite works in the exhibition on the right here, Jane Evans, who was, she ran a boarding house at Eton. And this is a portrait which was commissioned from Sargent by a group of the boys, the old boys of Eton. And I like this because it's just so unusual there's this sense of Sargent as a painter of very affluent people in a certain sector of society. But the fact that Jane Evans, who I think certainly wouldn't have been able to commission a portrait from Sargent by herself, but the fact that the boys whose lives she had such an influence over and who respected her so much, that they had clubbed together to commission Sargent to paint this portrait of her. And again, Black here as an expression of professional dress. I think this is really meaningful. And again, Sargent had a really good relationship with her and wrote very well of her. Sitting for Sargent, this is about the dynamic between Sargent and his sitters, Elsie Palmer, who is on the sideline, and we really make the most of just how uncanny and unsettling this portrait is, kind of the very strong symmetry. She wrote a diary about sitting for Sargent, and she was 17 at the time of this portrait, and she would write about feeling that she was doing nothing with her life but sitting with her hands in her lap, waiting for Sargent to finish painting her. Mrs. Hammersley was spoken about. Wonderful Possibilities. This is about the expressive qualities of clothing, and Graham Robertson in the middle of this room I've spoken about. Dr. Potsy on the left here in this red robe, I think is one of the highlights of the exhibition. And just such an exceptional and unusual male portrait of the 19th century. When you think about how most portraits of men of this period would be wearing these dark woolen suits as a kind of expression of respectability and status, the fact that Sargent painted this surgeon, Samuel Potsy, not as a public figure dressed in one of his tailored suits, but as the title of the painting says, at home, wearing this robe and slippers. You can see his slipper kind of poking out at the bottom of his robe in this really kind of lovely way. I think this says a lot about both Sargent and Potsy as kind of co-conspirators in this work, but also thinking about the way that the portrait functions on the wall of the Academy. So this was the first of Sargent's paintings to actually be shown at the RA summer exhibition. And when it was shown in there in 1882, Vernon Lee, Sargent's great friend, wrote about her description of it was to say that it displayed a kind of insolent magnificence, more or less kicking everything else off the walls. And I think that's the power of this very unconventional choice and painting Potsy looking like a cardinal in this crimson red. I think it's so effective. We then have a room on performance, which has two of the standout juxtapositions of painting and clothing, which are Carmencita and the dress that she wears. So Carmencita was a Spanish dancer on the left here, who Sargent was really captivated by when he saw her perform in New York, and she took some convincing to sit for him. Yeah, to give her lots of gifts. It's said, and she was, quite a kind of something of a diva. And Ellen Terry on the right, who again Sargent saw the first night of her performing as Lady Macbeth at the Lyceum in 1888, and was just captivated by this astonishing dress which Alice Comyns Carr had designed for her, which incredibly ornate, with hundreds of beetle wings stitched into it, and this kind of velvet cloak with griffins and these kind of robes of magenta hair, as Sargent wrote. And the painting, which you can see here, is, I think, particularly interesting to compare with the dress, and they're brought together here for the first time. So that it's really wonderful to see kind of how Sargent does and doesn't faithfully represent the dress in different areas. The painting is much more blue. And the pose is one which is not taken from the play, but it's one which Sargent and Terry developed together as a way of foregrounding the dress. So this moment of holding the crown isn't taken from the play, but obviously you can see how it means Sargent can really show off these sleeves and kind of get a certain dynamism to the composition. Cutting a figure, this is all about authority in different ways, and includes most of the portraits of military and political figures, but also artists and socialites as well. And we're talking here about the different ways that Sargent is conveying authority or status in different spheres of society. So we have, for instance, his painting of Lord Londonderry on the left at the coronation of Edward VII. And it's really wonderful to be able to lend the actual Londonderry jewels from the Londonderry settlement, so which are worn in the portrait, and particularly the garter, which is this garter which is worn on the left leg, which is really jutting out in a way which I think shows that Sargent wanted to give it particular prominence. I like that. Now, one of the more interesting works, which I really like being able to put this in the room because it's kind of quite unexpected, is this painting in the middle of Edouard Pailleron. It's the earliest painting in the exhibition from 1879. And Pailleron was a playwright and a dramatist. And its inclusion here is all about Sargent wanting to paint Pailleron with a certain bohemian credibility and this very deliberate nonchalance. His shirt is untucked. He's wearing this artisan's jacket. He's got these kind of, the collar is unbuttoned with these kind of tassels hanging down. And even the booklet which Pailleron holds, which is presumably a booklet of his own writing, it's tattered and dog-eared. And it's very much Pailleron saying, I'm an artist, I don't need to conform to the codes of behavior evidenced in the portraits that I would have hung alongside at the salon. So I think that in all these sectors of society, there are different rules and different codes, and that this is something that Sargent is particularly adept with, because he, as someone who is so international himself, having grown up in Europe and having had to insert himself into Parisian society and then in British society, which all come with their own codes, as someone who is still kind of understood within Europe as an American, first and foremost, he becomes someone who is very good at knowing what people want and how to give them what they want. And I think that that's something that contributes so much to his success and his preeminence. The Van Dyck of our times, this is about Sargent's references to old master portraiture and the way in which he will evoke different moments from the history of portraiture in turn. I just wanted to include this picture of Lady Agnew with, I think the woman stood next to the painting is actually a descendant of Lady Agnew, who came in dressed as the portrait one morning. So these are some of the works during the installation. So Matilda Hirsch, looking very much like a Velasquez. Sybil Sassoon, this is a portrait which is a wedding present for her, in which she looks very much, she evokes the Lely and Nella format. We actually think that this portrait specifically evokes a Lely painting, which actually hangs in Tate Britain. So you can actually walk from the Sargent exhibition to see kind of the prototype for this. And this is particularly relevant to Kenwood. Here we have a painting of Pauline Astor, which I think is very much of a piece with the wonderful Sargent portrait of Daisy Leiter. Exactly. So they were made, I think, either the same year or in successive years. And both Daisy Leiter and Pauline Astor were heiresses who Sargent he painted basically looking as though they'd stepped out of kind of the world of Gainsborough. The thing I always say about Pauline Astor, who had arrived in England shortly before this painting was made with her father, who had kind of this real estate fortune in America, but he'd recently unsuccessfully run for office in the States. So he'd moved to England. He'd bought both Cliveden and Hever Castle, as you do. And he commissioned this portrait of Pauline Astor. But unlike almost all of the paintings in this exhibition, it's not set within kind of an opulent interior. But I think Sargent specifically wants to get away from any sense of conspicuous consumption. And he wants to paint Pauline Astor looking at home within the English landscape. And Gainsborough is clearly his model there. And I think the same is largely true for Daisy Leiter. Nearly at the end of the exhibition, outside fashion, this takes us slightly away from commissioned portraiture and this parallel strain which Sargent is engaged with throughout his career, which is figures within landscapes, paintings of family and friends in which the sitters are identifiable, but they're not titled as portraits and they're not understood as portraits. And often these aren't exhibited in the same way. These are smaller and more informal and more intimate works in which you can see Sargent at his most experimental. And kind of the pivot for this room is this wonderful shawl that you can see in the foreground in this case, which is one of a number of shawls which belonged to Sargent. It's the only one which is now identifiable. So we don't know if this is exactly the same shawl that was used in some of these paintings. It may have been a combination, but it's certainly very similar. And you can recognize the characteristic inverted teardrop motif from both Kashmiri and Paisley shawls. So yes, so painting in the middle of this wall here, for instance, this is called Kashmir. And it shows 7 figures all wearing a shawl, which is very similar to, or it is this shawl, styled like a sari, arranged like a frieze. But they're not 7 different figures. They're in fact Sargent's niece repeated 7 times. And this is the kind of thing that you see a lot of in this final room, is that Sargent being very experimental with the way that he kind of in these paintings, he's really using the painting, he's emphasizing the painting as something constructed, in which he's not painting what's in front of him, but he is establishing an idea in his mind's eye, and he is taking the people and the props around him, and he's finding a way to reproduce that on the canvas. So this is Sargent kind of at his most experimental. To finish the exhibition, sort of end up back where we started. It's quite ironic that I don't actually have my own photograph of this final room, but there you go. So we started with Lady Sassoon and her opera cloak from 1907, and we end with her daughter, Sybil Sassoon, and this costume, which Sargent commissioned from the House of Worth from 1922. So it takes you full circle. And the fact that this is such a late portrait, we've already seen the portrait of Sybil looking like a Lely portrait, which Sargent gave to her as a wedding present in 1913. And here you have 9 years later, him painting her again in one of his last portraits. And just making that point about the intimacy and informality between Sargent and his sitters, which is really at the heart of, I think, what makes Sargent's greatest portraits so successful. I did have a lot more stuff to say to you, but I know that I'm already over 50 minutes, so I should probably stop there. And if anyone has any questions, then feel free to ask.